So, I've got a pitch for a movie. A young human hero is living in a futuristic setting where they're mostly surrounded by aliens. They're currently uncertain about their future, but suddenly find out about a MacGuffin that turns into a trail they have to follow to find something that'll make their life and the world around them better. While on their journey, they team up with a motley crew of fellow explorers, but end up being betrayed by at least one of them along the way. Eventually, there's a big climax with lots of explosions and a cataclysmic disaster that threatens to kill all of our heroes, but they manage to make it out alive, in some cases due to another person's self-sacrifice. Huh. Funny there were 3 animated science fiction movies like this in the 2000s, isn't it?
And it must be original because
I've seen every science fiction animated movie.
and I've never heard that one before.
At the start of the new millennium and following the Y2K boom, the possibilities of new technology was something that captured the imaginations of animated filmmakers all over, and this led to a series of very inspired, slightly more mature science fiction-based animated films to break onto the market. 3 big ones really stood out in particular from 3 different animation studios during this time: Treasure Planet from Disney, Titan AE from 20th Century Fox, and Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within from Columbia Pictures. Although now with Fox being owned by Disney, I guess Titan AE could also be considered a Disney movie at this point. Funny how that works.
Suck it, Fox. I'm going to Disneyland.
These 3 films really stand out from any other animated works that were out at the time, or really have come out since, due to the fact they lean into very high concept science fiction tales, rather than the usual fairy tales or folklore a lot of other animated films at the time had been drawing from. To this day, for better or for worse, there isn't really anything like these 3 films. So today, I want to discuss how exactly each of these incredibly unique science fiction animated films came to be, what works about them, what doesn't work, and also how they're looked back upon today, over 2 decades later. To start, let's look at perhaps the strangest and possibly most infamous out of the 3, Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within. Oh boy, this one sure is a can of worms. And yet, I can't help but kind of like it. For those unaware, Final Fantasy is an immensely popular series of role-playing video games that are more or less an anthology, usually starring a different protagonist and a different story each time. They're generally sword and sorcery games, putting a party of heroes in a vast fantasy world to explore and defeat a greater evil, with that fantasy world sometimes containing a lot more science fiction influence elements. In the case of this film, however, the connection between the Final Fantasy video games and this movie essentially stops at the movie's title. Back in the late 90s, Honorabu Sakaguchi, the creator of the Final Fantasy game series, was experiencing extreme success with his games, which were arguably at their peak in popularity throughout their entire history. Final Fantasy VII and VIII had both been huge commercial and critical hits for Squaresoft, which was then the publisher of the series. It was around this time that Sakaguchi began to consider the possibility of bringing this series to the big screen, since Squaresoft had already become an incredibly innovative force within the gaming industry overall, and could possibly bring this same level of spectacle and large-scale storytelling to the film space as well. As a result, Squaresoft ended up creating their own motion picture division called Square Pictures and creating a studio in Honolulu. Around this time, Sakaguchi was considering what happens to a person's spirit when they die, since his mother, whose name was Aki, had died in an accident several years before the making of the film. As a result, he named the main character in The Spirits Within Aki Ross, who is a scientist in a world where Earth has been infested by ghost-like aliens called phantoms who feast on the spirits of humans and instantly kill them upon contact, resulting in most of humanity sealing themselves away in barrier cities. Interestingly enough, Aki Ross was marketed in this film to be the world's first digital actress, meant to make all real actors and actresses obsolete, which was billed as more of a fun marketing gimmick than anything taken seriously, since this was still 6 years before actually fully digital creations like Hatsune Miku began to make the idea of blurring the lines between a digitally animated character and real-world performances more of a legitimate thing. And also about 20 years before it became even more of a real thing that started taking away careers for voice actors and writers, so take that as you will. Weirdly enough, Aki was meant to star in other movies following this one, including other Final Fantasy movies, and also live-action movies too, with Square Pictures even making a demo reel of her character walking through their studio and meeting with all the crew. In a weird sort of way, this concept was actually kind of ahead of its time, since the idea of a digital being interacting with people as if they were a real human was ultimately what a character such as the aforementioned Hatsune Miku ended up becoming, with her performing live to hundreds of thousands of people as the world's first digital singer. And you could even make the argument that VTubers also in some ways embody this concept, since the whole idea of a VTuber is being a digitally constructed being that is able to enrapture and engage your audience and somewhat blur the line between what is reality and what is fiction. Wow, I guess that means I'm the new Aki Ross now, thanks Square. So in that sense, Final Fantasy Spirits Within was actually kind of ahead of its time. The character of Aki Ross was voiced by Ming-Na Wen, who had previously been best known for working with Disney on movies such as The Joy Luck Club, and most notably being the voice of Mulan in the 1998 animated film. The cast for this film is surprisingly stacked overall, with Alec Baldwin, Don Sutherland, Steve Buscemi, Perry Gilpin, and James Woods all providing voices as well. Dang, somehow this movie got both Mulan and Hades in it. This film is also notable for being the first ever photorealistic animated film, and honestly for the time, it is wildly impressive. This film came out in 2001, and it is absolutely wild to see Square's ability to pull off this level of animation at such an early era. In a lot of ways, I think this movie still looks good, and for the time, this was revolutionary. So with all this technology prowess behind it, a very stacked cast, and some surprisingly ahead of its time ideas, this film was probably a huge success when it came out, right?
No.
Unfortunately, no. No, it very much was not. Final Fantasy The Spirits Within cost about $71 million at the start of its production, but due to rising costs throughout the production, such as the need to hire more motion capture actors and animators to animate the, at the time, massive amounts of polygons that each character had, over 100,000 each, that by the end of production, the film had cost $137 million, almost double its original budget. And how did it perform when it released? It only managed to make back $85 million of its extraordinarily high budget. Oops. This resulted in Square losing over $100 million on the movie, and immediately resulting in the closure of Square Pictures, almost right after it had been founded. This also almost resulted in the closure of Squaresoft itself, and them almost resigning from making video games altogether, but thankfully they were saved by the big success of both Final Fantasy X and Kingdom Hearts, as well as merging with fellow RPG publisher Enix, who is best known for making the Dragon Quest games. This film is notable for being a massive failure on so many fronts, but weirdly enough, upon watching it for the first time for this video, I kinda can't help but be fascinated by it. This is such an interesting footnote in the history of computer animation overall, and it's really interesting to see where Square specifically wanted to take this technology, hoping to create a future of digitally produced actors and actresses. However, while the technology on display is honestly really impressive for the time, I personally found the film itself to be really lacking. For a film called Final Fantasy The Spirits Within, it doesn't really have anything to do with Final Fantasy at all. It's more just a generic dystopian science fiction adventure, and only has a few sparse elements from the actual game, such as a character named Sid, and also a life force at the Earth's core called Gaia. It really makes me question why they felt the need to put Final Fantasy in the title at all. It also is an incredibly dull looking film, with the entire color palette just being a really ugly combination of gray, beige, and sometimes black. Despite the technical imagery of this film being insane, it's not really all that vibrant or overly interesting to look at. On top of this, the characters in this are just as dull as the color palette. Despite casting some absolutely fantastic actors here, it really just feels like every character is so dull and lifeless. None of these characters really give you a reason to root for them or care about what they're trying to do at all. It just makes for such a mediocre experience. Overall, while I don't think this film is nearly as bad as people usually make it out to be, I definitely do think it has a number of problems that ultimately did contribute to it being a very expensive failure and nearly killing an entire studio. But I do find it utterly fascinating for just so much of the production behind it and why it was made at all. Also, somehow Aki Ross was featured in Maxim as one of the year's hottest women. Wow. Part 2, Titan AE. Titan AE may very well be the most 2000s and early 2000s animated film has ever been. It's another pretty notable entry in this era of science fiction themed animated films being pushed by major studios. It stars Matt Damon of all people as basically an animated version of himself named Kale floating through space after Earth has been destroyed and teaming up with a ragtag crew of aliens and humans to try and find a ship called the Titan, which could be the last hope to save humanity forever. This film was directed by Don Bluth, a legendary animator who had directed some of the biggest non-Disney animated films of all time previously, such as The Land Before Time and An American Tail, Fievel Goes West. Needless to say, this is very much a far cry from anything he'd done before, since while Bluth had absolutely handled a lot of darker animated films before, a grand science fiction epic about the end of humanity wasn't really something anyone had on their radar from him. And that's because it wasn't actually his idea, nor his choice to work on the film. What a shock! That's Hollywood for you, baby! In 1994, Bluth ended up establishing Fox Animation Studios, which would be an animation studio personally run by him under 20th Century Fox. This studio created Anastasia, which at the time became Bluth's most successful film he'd ever made, making $140 million against a budget of $53 million. Immediately following this success, Don Bluth was brought in to direct what was then called Planet Ice, which was initially going to be a live-action film that quickly pivoted to becoming animated, after Bill Mechanic, a former Disney executive who was then the chairman of 20th Century Fox, saw the script and thought it should get an animated treatment instead. He ended up contacting Don Bluth and Fox Animation Studios to handle it instead, since Fox had actually been laying off a lot of the animation staff overall. Essentially, if this film wasn't a big success, like something like Anastasia had been, the studio would be shut down. As a result, Bluth and his team decided it would be best to incorporate as much CGI as possible to try and hook in as much of an audience as they possibly could, since it was around this time it was becoming abundantly more clear that audiences were beginning to favor computer-generated animation over hand-drawn animation, since it was a new trailblazer in the realm of animation with movies like Toy Story from Pixar and Ants from DreamWorks. As a result, while the film animates all its characters and most of the backgrounds with traditional cell animation, most other elements like spacesuits, weapons, and certain building structures are entirely made out of CGI. This gives the film a really distinct look that honestly doesn't look like anything else at the time or really since then. Titan AE really has an aesthetic to call its own. So with a pretty distinct aesthetic and a master of animation like Don Bluth behind it, this film was probably a big success and saved Fox Animation Studios from being shut down, right?
False.
Unfortunately, nope, that didn't happen at all. During the time of Titan AE's release, things at Fox were getting extremely heated between Bill Mechanic, who, as stated before, was the person who greenlit Titan AE to begin with, and also Rupert Murdoch, who was at the time the owner of 20th Century Fox. Murdoch was mad at Bill for greenlighting several darker films that hadn't seen a profit during their theatrical run, most notably the film Fight Club, which apparently he was deeply offended at for how it seemed to encourage rebellion against what larger organizations try to set in place for their workers. Gee, I wonder why he got offended by that. Sure is a mystery to me. As a result, Mechanic was immediately fired from Fox, and because of this, Fox pulled out of marketing Titan AE at all just before its release. As a result, the film opened in 5th place at the box office and only managed to gross $37 million against a budget of around $90 million. This inevitably resulted in the closure of Fox Animation Studios, and also this is the last movie that Don Bluth ever worked on. Wow, the 2000s sure was busy with closing animation studios. Now we're 2 for 2 on science fiction animated movies that completely destroyed an entire animation studio. This film itself, I would actually say, is an improvement over Final Fantasy, since Kale, I would say, is definitely much more interesting than Aki. You do kinda already get to see his life get off to a brutal start, with him literally being evacuated off of Earth and being forced to watch his own home planet be blown up by a race of evil energy aliens in his struggle to find his place in the galaxy that doesn't really seem to want him at all. He's always facing prejudice from various aliens he works with who view him as a part of a dying breed. Like, that genuinely is an interesting idea you can flesh out and work with more, in my opinion. However, I do feel this film doesn't fully dive into this concept as much as I would like. The potential idea of human versus alien racism is just kinda left at the door of the film and isn't really brought up again until the end of the film, when an alien member decides to randomly sell out Kale and the other humans to the energy aliens to have them destroy them? Okay, I guess. You didn't really explore this idea of humans being seen as a dying breed outside of a brief moment in the first 20 minutes of this film, so why should I care when it's mentioned again in the climax here? Also, this alien is genuinely an awful twist villain. He has shown no real foreshadowing that he's gonna betray his crew outside of being an alien, I guess? Which also doesn't really make any sense because there are 2 other aliens on the crew who don't betray the humans, and one of them is voiced by Sid the Sloth for some reason.
A dandelion. Must be the last one of the season.
All in all, while this film is genuinely really cool looking even to this day in my opinion, with its really inspired aesthetic and awesome Don Bluth alien designs, I do think it's rather lacking, since it does present some interesting ideas, but it doesn't really bother to fully delve into them. However, I do still get some genuine enjoyment out of it, and it's a movie that you just really wouldn't see made today. Give it a watch if you're curious, you might just find something you like in it. Part 3, Treasure Planet. And now we've come to what is probably the most well-known, and also possibly most infamous, movie out of all of these. The 2002 animated science fiction film from Walt Disney, Treasure Planet. Treasure Planet is an animated science fiction take on the classic book Treasure Island, which had been the passion project of Disney animation directors Ron Clements and John Musker for 16 years when it came out. They wanted to take the classic story of Treasure Island, but update it with a fresh space-themed twist. It was actually pitched initially as far back as 1985 by the 2 directors to Disney, but unfortunately the concept was rejected by then chairman of Disney, Michael Eisner. However, Ron and John went on to create some of the most successful Disney animated films of this era, such as The Great Mouse Detective, The Little Mermaid, and Aladdin. As a result, Ron and John went back to Eisner to pitch their idea again, but it was rejected yet again. Finally, Eisner caved, saying if the directors made a very easily marketable film, they can make Treasure Planet. So they went ahead and made one of Disney's absolute greatest bangers ever. Seriously, I love Hercules so much. Hades is the best Disney villain, don't at me. And so finally, in 2002, Ron and John got to make the movie they'd always wanted to make. Strangely enough, these constant delays actually aided the production of such an ambitious animated film, since by the time Treasure Planet had come out, Disney had started using a new type of animation software called Deep Canvas, which had actually been first used in Tarzan. Deep Canvas was often used by Disney's animators to create 3D computer-generated models that could be painted over to blend in with 2D hand-drawn characters and set pieces. With Treasure Planet featuring a lot of shots of wide, sweeping planets or steampunk pirate ships floating through space, this was the perfect breakthrough in animation technology to use here. However, using this technology so extensively also came at a cost to the film itself, a $140 million cost, in fact. The budget for this film got so big it remains the most expensive traditionally animated film ever to this day. So, with all the money and passion thrown into this film, did Ron and John's passion project become a huge success? I mean, you know the answer at this point. No, it didn't. The film debuted in 4th place at the box office when it came out and made $109 million against its $140 million budget, and also had the extreme displeasure of releasing against the second Harry Potter film, Disney's own sequel to The Santa Claus, and the James Bond film Die Another Day. And just a week after that, it dropped even further thanks to the theatrical debut of Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers, which crushed just about everything at the box office that year. This film ultimately was a major box office disappointment, a science fiction animated adventure that failed to become a huge thing, much like Titan AE and Final Fantasy before it. But unlike those two movies, I actually think this film is legitimately amazing. This is easily one of Disney's best animated films they've ever made, in my opinion. This film follows young Jim Hawkins, a rebellious teen who encounters a dying elderly pirate who gives him a map to a planet where ancient buried treasure is supposedly hidden. Jim sees this as a great opportunity to escape his mundane life and do something that could be seen as great, and something that could be seen great in his mother's eyes so she doesn't view him as a troublemaker constantly. He ends up boarding a ship with a very rough and tumble crew of alien pirates, most notably an alien cyborg named Long John Silver, who bar none is easily one of the best Disney villains ever made. He is so deep with his characterization, and he and Jim gradually bond together during their time on the ship, with John Silver becoming sort of a father figure to Jim, the father he never had. Jim's father left him and his mother at a very young age, and he's carried this sense of cynicism about the world around him ever since, which has resulted in him constantly getting into trouble and being seen as somewhat of a juvenile delinquent. However, this changes when he meets John Silver, someone who actually understands Jim and his jaded view of the world around him, which allows Jim, for the first time in a long time, to really open up to someone. And John Silver also cares about Jim because he sees so much of himself in him. But the cruel irony of this is John Silver is on this ship that Jim just so happens to also be on because he wants to take it over by mutiny and find the treasure planet for himself. This results in him genuinely conflicting with his feelings about Jim and being the father he never really had, but he also wants to keep his goal in mind about getting the wealth that he's been looking for so long. It's a genuinely really compelling character dynamic, and I don't think there's ever really been another Disney villain like John Silver. Heck, John Silver is also the only Disney villain to actually get redeemed by the film's end, since ultimately he does the right thing and saves Jim when the treasure planet is about to implode on itself, since at the end of the day, he truly does care. God, I love this movie so much. If you haven't seen it yet, go watch Treasure Planet. This is easily one of Disney's finest animated works they have ever made, in my opinion. Overall, the trend of science fiction animated films in the early 2000s may have mostly resulted in financial failure, but there's no denying that all three of these films really made quite an incredibly bold statement when they released, and there's never really been something quite like them since. While I personally only really care for Treasure Planet, I can totally see why someone would love Titan AE or even Spirits Within, especially if they're films you grew up with. I think movies like these are really the ones that especially speak to a new generation of animators and writers with just how distinct and high concept they are, being grand science fiction epics told within animation. I do hope someday we'll see another film like one of these pop up, but for now, I am more than happy to go back and revisit Treasure Planet and experience its science fiction, heart-filled tale time and time again.
You got the makings of greatness in you, but you gotta take the helm and chart your own course. Stick to it, no matter the squalls. And when the time comes, you get the chance to really test the cut of your sails and show what you're made of. Well, I hope I'm there.
Hey, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you liked it, be sure to give it a like, and if you didn't like it, give it a like anyway. If you haven't subscribed already, definitely consider doing so. I discuss film-related topics overall, so if you enjoyed this video, you'll likely enjoy the other videos I have planned as well. If you have a topic you think I should cover here on YouTube, be sure to leave a comment down below telling me what it is. You can also join my Discord to engage with a lot of like-minded people overall and discuss film, video games, cartoons, and many other things like that. You can also check out my Letterboxd, which is linked down below as well, where I review movies and shows, oftentimes movies and shows I won't cover here on YouTube. But regardless, thank you so much for watching today's video. I've been Otterly Noah, and I'll see you on the other side. Bye!